Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into what I think is a truly fascinating linguistic puzzle, and it's one that sits right at the very foundation of how we understand universal law, human communication, and classical Islamic jurisprudence, which is known as Usool al-Fiqh. We're going to literally decode the exact mechanics of how we universally interpret commands. Now, I know it sounds incredibly simple at first glance, but I promise you, the logical framework behind a simple order is nothing short of brilliant.
Okay, let's dive into this. Just try this relatable, everyday thought experiment for a second. When someone gives you a direct command, what does it actually require of you? Does the command automatically mean you have to keep repeating the action again and again, forever? Or does it only require you to do it exactly once to fully fulfill it? Well, to answer that, we need to look at three classical terms.
So here's the first piece of our classical toolkit, amr. Simply put, amr is just a command or an order. Whether it's coming from a boss, a teacher, or a divine text, an amr is a request for an action to be performed. And this is really the starting point of our exploration into the deep philosophy of law through universal logic.
Which brings us to our second term, and really the core conflict of this world explainer, takrar, which simply means repetition. The scholars of Usool al-Fiqh asked a really profound question here. Does an amr automatically equal takrar? Like, does an order inherently carry the weight of repetition built right into its very wording?
To find out, we have to look at our third term, which is the specific type of command we're decoding today, amr mutlaq. This is a general, entirely unrestricted command, so it has no special clauses, no specific conditions, and absolutely no timeframes attached to it. It's just the raw command itself. So, how does human logic actually process an amr mutlaq?
Okay, let's look at a super simple, everyday example. Imagine a teacher tells a student, "Open the window." What happens? Well, the student walks over, opens the window once, and sits back down, right? The command is fulfilled. Nobody in the room just assumes that the student must keep getting up and opening the window every 5 minutes, or, stand there opening and closing it forever. So the basic baseline rule is established right here. An unrestricted command requires the action to be done just once.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how seamlessly this classical logic maps right onto our modern lives. In classical fiqh, if a man tells his friend, "Divorce my wife on my behalf," the friend acts as his representative and issues exactly one divorce. Now, if the husband later remarries that same woman, the friend cannot use that original permission to just divorce her again. The command was fulfilled, and so it expired. It's the exact same logic as telling someone, "Sell my car for me." Once they sell it, if you happen to buy that same car back a year later, your friend can't just sell your car again using that old permission. One command, one fulfillment.
But wait, there's a really fascinating exception here, depending entirely on the nature of the act itself. If a businessman says, "Hire employees for my company," this naturally allows his assistant to perform multiple hires over time. Why? Well, because the command relates to an ongoing category, not a single fixed act. It's kind of like the classical example of a man saying, "Find me a wife." That open category allows for repeated actions. But if he explicitly says, "Hire one driver," the act is fixed, and the permission ends after a single specific hire.
And this brings us to a brilliantly logical principle that the scholars laid out. When an unrestricted command, an amr mutlaq, is given, it naturally snaps to one of two absolute extremes. It means the absolute minimum amount needed to fulfill the request, or it can mean the absolute maximum amount, provided the speaker explicitly intended it that way. But importantly, it can never mean a random middle amount. Let's actually see this in action.
Let's look at the absolute minimum first. Suppose a person takes an oath and says, "I will not drink water." What is the absolute minimum threshold to break this oath? It's 1. Even a single drop or a single tiny sip of water breaks the oath entirely, because the absolute minimum meaning of drinking water has officially occurred.
But remember that maximum rule we just talked about? Technically, in the discussions of Usool, if the person swearing the oath had a very strange, highly specific intention in their head and meant, "I will not drink literally all the water in the entire world," then their oath actually remains unbroken until they somehow manage to drink the ocean. It's a bit humorous, sure, but it perfectly proves the strict linguistic boundary here. Unrestricted words can stretch to the maximum possible meaning, but only if specifically intended.
Now, we can apply this exact same minimum and maximum logic to classical divorce rules. If a husband tells his wife to divorce herself, what's the baseline fulfillment? It's exactly one divorce. One is the minimum required to fulfill that amr mutlaq.
Let's move on and see how this builds. If the husband actually intended the maximum limit of divorce when he gave that totally unrestricted command, then 3 divorces can legally occur. The law completely respects the linguistic stretch from the minimum of 1 all the way to the absolute maximum of 3, based entirely on the speaker's intention.
But here is where the logic just gets airtight. What if the husband intended exactly 2 divorces? Well, the scholars tell us that usually this intention completely fails. Why? Because 2 is an arbitrary random middle amount. Remember, an unrestricted command strictly anchors to either the minimum or the maximum boundaries. However, and this is a fascinating quirk of classical legal mathematics, a slave was legally restricted to a maximum of 2 divorces. So, in that very specific historical context, intending 2 actually worked because for them, 2 wasn't the middle, 2 was the absolute maximum. The underlying logic remains perfectly, beautifully consistent across all categories.
So the crucial point is, we absolutely have to address the giant elephant in the room here. We've clearly established that a basic command only requires one action. So if the text commands us to pray, why don't Muslims just perform one single prayer in their entire lifetime, dust off their hands and call it a day? Why is there continuous daily worship? Honestly, it's an excellent question, and the classical answer is an absolute masterclass in legal reasoning.
Well, the answer lies in this one word, sabab. Sabab is the principal cause or reason that makes an action obligatory. The scholars reveal that repetition in worship doesn't actually come from the linguistic command to pray. The wording itself doesn't just magically mean repeat forever. Rather, the repetition comes entirely from the repetition of the sabab, the underlying cause.
And this brilliantly illustrates the concept through a modern analogy. Think about the command to pay your rent. That sentence doesn't force you into endless repetition all by itself. You pay rent repeatedly because every single new month creates a new due date, a brand new cause. It's the exact same logic with praying Zohar. The command to pray doesn't repeat endlessly. Rather, the specific time for Zohar enters anew every single day, creating a brand new obligation.
Let's cement this whole sabab concept with just one more analogy, just to make sure it's crystal clear. When a school instructs students to attend class, those students show up every day. They don't do this because the English phrase attend class somehow means repeat this forever. No, they do it because every time the sun rises on a new school day, a new distinct obligation is triggered. The cause repeats, so the action repeats. Make sense, right?
All right, let's zoom out and summarize the core logic here so we have the complete picture. The default, absolute baseline rule is that a command only requires one fulfillment. That is it. However, exceptions definitely exist where repetition is required, but only if there is a recurring cause, the sabab, or clear context, a highly specific intention, a customary practice, or some other piece of solid external evidence.
As you can see, this logical framework maps absolutely perfectly onto both everyday life and universal law. Close the door or wash the car, you just do it once. But pay rent or pray Zohar, you repeat the action not because the verbs pay or pray told you to repeat them forever, but strictly because the underlying condition, that due date, or that specific time of day, has returned. It is just an incredibly precise way of understanding language.
Which brings us to our final golden rule, beautifully preserved in the classical texts of Usool al-Fiqh. Al-amr la yaqtadi at-tikrar. A command does not automatically necessitate repetition. By simply decoding this one sentence today, we've unlocked a massive, incredibly dense framework of classical logic that governs both divine texts and our own human contracts.
So I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to take away. Now that you understand the hidden linguistic boundaries of minimums, maximums, and repeating causes, how will this change the way you interpret the everyday instructions you give and the commands you receive in your own life today? Really think about it next time you are told to do something. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep exploring the logic all around you.